Good afternoon, everyone who's present here today with us, and thank you so much for attending this conversation. My name is Saajid Hosein, and I will be moderating today's Youth Roundtable entitled Generation Equality and GBV, a COVID-19 conversation for the 16 days of activism. Now, we all know that violence against women is very prevalent in Trinidad and Tobago. Just this year, we've lost over 20 women in cases of domestic violence in our country. So for that reason, we would like to take a moment of silence to think about and honor these victims before we proceed. Okay, so today's webinar is hosted by IGDS Ignite, an undergraduate mentorship group under the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at UWI. This initiative is part of our contribution to the UN's Generation Equality Campaign, which marks the 25-year anniversary of the Beijing platform, with the main purpose of bringing together activists to continue striving for women's empowerment. An integral part of this includes the fight against gender-based violence, or GBV, which is what we will be discussing in today's webinar. The Institute recognizes the importance of youth in these discussions, especially as their voices play a crucial role in advocacy against all forms of gender inequality. And today's panelists are a testament to that. We have a dynamic group of young activists here with us today who play an instrumental role in national conversations surrounding GBV. The first is Kelsey Joseph, who is a UWI Stat ambassador and a mental health advocate, and she is also one of the co-founders of the Calls of UWI movement. She will be highlighting street harassment as a form of GBV for us today. Next up is Nixon, who is currently the president of Pride UWI and at the UWI St. Augustine campus, and a member of IGDS Ignite. They will be discussing GBV as it relates to the LGBT plus community. We also have Samantha Samlall, a member of the UWI Student Psychology Association and a vocal mental health advocate who will be talking about the psychological impact of GBV. And finally, we have Taribo Branche, who is the secretary of the UWI Afrikaan Society, and who was involved in helping to amend a recent issue in relation to sexual assault in his group. So he will be offering us a best practice. To all of our panelists, welcome, and thank you for joining us in this conversation today. Today's proceedings will start off with brief presentations from each of them, where they talk a little bit about their work in advocacy and their areas of interest, followed by a discussion. After that, we will be taking questions from our viewers or others present in the chat today. So you can leave your questions in the chat and I will pose them to the panel. So without further ado, I give you our first presenter for this afternoon, Kelsie Joseph. Kelsey, take it away.
Thank you, Saajid. Good afternoon to our distinguished panelists and viewers. I'm very happy to be a part of this diverse panel of youth to learn from their different perspectives, engage, and contribute meaningfully with my peers. In doing the work of Calls of UWI, I can definitely say the personal is political. I myself have experienced street harassment and being catcalled from a very young age. This made me very uncomfortable and conscious of my body and image as well. As a sexual assault survivor, I recognize the importance of this kind of work. Choking stories and amplifying voices has been a therapeutic form of healing for myself. Being a part of Choke Back, the international youth-led movement against gender-based street harassment, provides me with a sense of community and support system. For many of us, don't even recognize street harassment as a form of gender-based violence. You know, it does not only affect a victim physically, but psychologically as well. The physical effects can be a threat to your body, change of routine, change of clothing, and the psychological or emotional effects can be the fear it creates and the trauma suffered. And we will hear a little bit more of this from my peer Samantha. Street harassment is a form of violence that takes place in the street or public spaces. Catcalling is a type of street harassment which is linked to gender-based violence. GBV is a form of violence directed to someone based on their gender identity. Women, girls, and LGBT plus individuals are more likely to endure this type of violence. It includes, but not limited to, unwanted sexual advances, comments about a person's physical appearance, suiting, and vulgar gestures. As we have been adapting to COVID-19, so is harassment. Street harassment still occurs, but it has evolved in different ways and different spaces. For 16 days of activism, Choke Back members globally have chalked so many stories of online harassment, including stories we have chalked of women being harassed to answer unwanted video calls and unsolicited nudes being sent. We see this in our cyberspaces, such as our Instagram and Twitter platforms. We have noticed a trend of men are more aggressive via online with their comments on women's pictures, tracking any DMs, as we just call it, and backlash for women, sharing their stories and downplaying this as well. For example, good old street harassment is still very prevalent and occurring. I've been catcalled for wearing my mask while walking down the street. Despite men not being able to see a face and not fully exposed as usual, does not stop from being catcalled, but the entitlement of women's bodies, and they feel safe enough to express this harassment still. At Calls of UWI, our goals and objectives are: 1, to educate persons on this issue of street harassment in a creative way by using choke and choking back. Bringing awareness to the public that street harassment victims should not accept this as compliments. Create a comfortable environment, just like our platform, where people can use concrete ways to intervene when they witness something is happening, and lastly, to combat instances of street harassment on our campus. IGDS Ignite is a youth-led undergrad mentorship program, and UWI itself is a very youthful space, and this is why youth voices are necessary and crucial in the conversation of sexual harassment and catcalling, since we often engage in such problematic behaviors and are victims as well. In order for institutions such as UWI and wider society to acknowledge that street harassment and catcalling as a social phenomenon, youth can play a pivotal role in bringing awareness and amplifying stories through more conversations like these.
Thank you, Kelsey, so much for that. And I especially really like how you point out that street harassment is a form of GBV, because it is, and we don't necessarily think about that. So thank you for that. And what I wanted to ask you is, how do you see the work of Calls of UWI expanding to make a larger impact in the years to come?
Thank you for that really great question, Saj. Well, the 3 areas of our work is focused on, and we are looking to expand, are firstly, programming, media campaigns and outreach activities, such as going into secondary schools and other universities like ours to educate young persons about street harassment and catcalling who may not be aware of this issue and its implications. We often get so comfortable in doing this form of activism within our feminist and safe spaces, we sometimes forget we need to reach a wider audience who may be participating in or experiencing this form of GBV. Secondly, capacity building. Since IGDS Ignite is a youth-led club, we want to work with a lot, and we work with a lot of other clubs and organizations. We think it is important and necessary that persons receive training to be sensitized and equipped with the necessary tools and information to help facilitate the work of Calls of UWI and really drive it, you know. And finally, the third one we want to look at is research. So our positions and arguments can be driven by empirical evidence, since the data we have currently is more anecdotal, along with teaming up with experts and academics to write about this issue. For instance, Calls of UWI collaborated with the African Students Union and documented mounted stories of sexual harassment that takes place at their location, you know. And with Caribbean Feminists, we also collaborated for a live Twitter chat, and we gathered the data and created a summary report. So we want to do something, we want to do in the future similar and more complex research we like to be done in the future. So therefore, these areas would reflect and overlap the 4 pillars of generation equality as fund, prevent, respond, and collect. It definitely shows the intersects and future plans to combat this form of gender-based violence that we experience. Yeah.
Thanks, Kelsey, for that. And I'm really excited to see where Calls of UWI goes in the future. Excellent work.
Thank you.
And if anybody doesn't know, you could follow Calls of UWI on Instagram at Calls of UWI. Yes. Okay. So now we have our next panelist who will be giving us a short presentation on GBV as it relates to the LGBT community, and that is Mia Nixon. So Mia, whenever you're ready.
So hi again, everyone. I'm Mia. I am the current president of Pride UWI at the St. Augustine campus. I hope everyone is hearing me properly. Right, so I just want to give you all a quick background of what we do in Pride UWI. So Pride UWI basically is an organization that was founded to create a safe space as well as a club that facilitates awareness and as well as facilitating a form of community bonding, especially for queer youth on campus. So we basically facilitate them being able to come and just be themselves, right? So in today's presentation, I'm going to be speaking about intimate partner violence as well as hate crimes, because these are 2 of the more prominent forms of GBV that affect the queer community within Trinidad and Tobago. But first, I would like to point out the connection between homophobia and gender-based violence, because I feel as though it is something that is really spoken about. Because as a lot of us on here know that homophobia works side by side with heterosexism, right? And it is also experienced by persons not even who are outside of the LGBTQ plus community, because homophobia is not only targeted towards persons within the community, but others who are outside of it who may be perceived as being queer. Right, so an example of this can be seen where a lot of youth in school experience bullying or even at home because they are perceived as being queer, or if they happen to be openly queer persons in a secondary school space. This can even lead to some of them, becoming suicidal or engaging in very self-harm and detrimental behaviors. Because we all know school can be very stressful as it is already, so having to, deal with additional problems might be very hard for youth. Another example is just like simply walking down the street with your partner and receiving glares or stares from other persons. Or this is a commonly asked question within same-sex relationships where they ask one person who is the man or who is the woman, because that in itself is a form of violence, because you are basically erasing the fact that you know, this is a same-sex union because it's not recognized as a relationship in that person's eyes, because one person has to be a man and one person has to be a woman, right? So now I'm gonna speak on the hate crime specifically, because I'm sure, I don't know if most of you will remember, there were two very public hate crimes that happened within Trinidad and Tobago, where Sasha Fierce was killed on December 5th, 2017, a trans woman, as well as Akil Thomas, who was stabbed approximately 13 times and was hospitalized. And another thing I want to point out too is the fact that even when Sasha was being buried, her family misgendered her, and she was buried as, like, I believe her birth given name was Keon, so that in itself is an act of violence. I also want to speak on the fact that a lot of same-sex couples have a fear of being kicked out when they access renting, or like when they access or gain access to being, like, you know, any access to housing as well. And then I wanted to highlight that even though cases such as what happened with Sasha and Akil were publicized, we have to think about the many other cases that were not reported, or the ones that were reported and nothing was done to to give aid to persons within the community. So the last area I'm going to speak about today is intimate partner violence, right? Because this term is widely used in describing domestic violence, but for persons who are in queer relationships, right? Because domestic violence is commonly used for heterosexual relationships, right? So I want to point out that the fact that there's a lack of legislation to protect victims of this crime, because non-heterosexual unions are not legal, or nor are they recognized by the government. I'm sure we all know that. Therefore, if this crime were to happen, no justice would be awarded to the victims, right? And I would also like to talk about the fact that within a majority of queer persons' life, they tend to get kicked out of their house for being who they are, right, which causes them to be placed in vulnerable situations where they can enter relationships with persons who have a sense of power over them, because that's how they get kicked out at a very young age. Because, you know, sometimes youth are very impressionable, especially queer ones who have been displaced, and they encounter partners that offer them the world, like, you know, money. I could give you a place to stay, I could give you food, etc., because that's basically what they will need. And they fall into the cycle where they become used and abused, and they not because they lack that emotional support or lack guidance, they fall into that cycle where they can potentially end up in intimate partner relationships where it becomes violent, right? So in order to prevent hate crimes, there needs to be a change in legislation, right? Because if there's a change in legislation, it would be better for queer persons to have access to protect themselves, right? I would also like to point out that not enough data is being done or researched in terms of how gender-based violence affects people within the LGBTQ plus community, because it allows people to be aware of how gender-based violence affects persons who aren't necessarily in male to female relationships. I would also like to point out that the fact is numerous studies have shown that within our newfound situation where we're living in COVID now, it has become very challenging for queer youth as well as queer people in general to access healthcare, to access proper forms of education, because most persons within the community tend to live in a low economic status. And the last thing I would like to talk about, I would like to point out some of the organizations that, you know, lots of queer youth can contact in case they have been displaced and they want to seek protection. And these places will help them will navigate them. No, this place will give them the necessary tools to navigate their current circumstances, especially with what's going on in COVID as well. And we need to ensure that these places receive proper funding, right? Because they are basically just running themselves. And maybe it kind of become hard now because within these organizations do not do this work for money. And we have to make sure that they are the capacity to facilitate enough queer, as much as queer youth as possible, right? So one of the organizations I'll be talking about is KAISO. So KAISO, I'm sure everyone knows KAISO, the Trans Coalition, the Silver Lining Foundation, I Am One, and Friends for Life. Because Friends for Life in particular is an organization that is targeted towards low-income queer persons. The Trans Coalition is targeted primarily towards trans women within Trinidad and Tobago, and CAISO is more of like an awareness building group. And the Silver Lining Foundation deals with bullying, combating bullying, and um, practices that help persons recognize their biases, especially within the education system. So they work with a lot of teachers or like a lot of lecturers. So yeah, that was my time. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Mia, and I think you raised some really excellent and important points there. I also appreciated how you shared those resources with us. Could you repeat the fourth one that you said? Because I just want to put it in the chat so that people could access it. Was it I Am One?
Yeah, I will repeat all of them in case you all did not hear me properly. So it's CAISO, right? So the acronym spelled is CAISO, the Trans Coalition, the Silver Lining Foundation, I Am One, and Friends for Life.
I Am One and Friends for Life.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Mia. And I really found it interesting what you were talking about in terms of how, you know, we don't even recognize LGBT, the way that we don't recognize LGBT relationships and unions from an institutional perspective, how that leads to them essentially being erased when it comes to conversations about intimate partner violence and GBV. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on why there aren't any avenues, right, for the LGBT community to have like domestic mediation.
Okay, so I would like to firstly say, we all know that within Trinidad and Tobago, same-sex unions are not recognized. Sadly, it is illegal still. And for even persons living within, like I would say, high-income households or persons who are within straight relationships, it's kind of hard for people within Trinidad to be able to access like mental health care to begin with. So I believe that that is in itself is a challenge we have to overcome. But moving along to like being able to find counselors that would work with same-sex couples in terms of settling their disputes, it could be very hard, right? Because one, if it is they don't have the funding for themselves to do it, and then two, there's the whole idea of them actually finding a therapist or someone who is willing to like, work with them. What is it to say that they're not going to have preconceived notions about persons who are in same-sex couples, right? And that will be defeating the purpose of having them go to actually, find someone who will help them handle their domestic disputes, because that's basically what a therapist is supposed to do. They're supposed to come in and help people. But how are they to do that when they have these notions of what their relationship should look like? Uh, they maybe have this thing where they they may end up like showcasing their biases when helping them, which will defeat the purpose, like I said, once again. So, yeah, because it's really difficult for people to get access to mental health care to begin with. So, for couples, I imagine it will be like maybe even harder, specifically when within the queer community. So, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, definitely a lot of obstacles for us to have to think about in this particular conversation. So thank you, Mia, so much for that. Before we move on to our next presenter, I just wanted to quickly say that we are taking questions. Closer to the end, we will be posing questions to the panelists. So if you want to leave your questions in the chat now, if you had any questions, particularly for Kelsey or Mia, since they already presented, please leave them in the chat now. We'll take note of them. And then if we have time, we'll come back and try to answer some of them closer to the end of the session. Okay, cool. So our next presenter is Samantha, who is part of the UWI Student Psychology Association, and she will be talking about the impacts that GBV has on mental health. So Samantha, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am the Vice President of UWI Student Psychology Association. We are based on mental health, and we support mental health advocacy and breaking the stigma towards mental health. So I would like to talk a little bit about, how mental health both affects the victim and the perpetrator. So we know that mental health is something that not just affects, it's not just a mood. It affects every aspect of someone's life. And especially being in a situation where you are being abused, whether it be physically, financially, sexually, emotionally, it has and it takes a toll on someone's mental health. Mental health has shown that some of the most, research on mental health have shown that some of the most common consequences of gender-based violence are post-traumatic stress disorders, anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and suicidal thoughts. There was an article that was posted on the UWI's campus news website addressing gender-based violence. And it mentioned that the greater economic and psychological stress on families due to income loss and heightened insecurity has the ability to exacerbate the vulnerability of both girls and women to physical and sexual abuse and violence in their homes from family members and partners. But we are supposed to also mention that it's not just because of COVID-19. We say, yes, COVID-19, there has been a rise in cases, reported cases of domestic violence, but it existed pre-COVID-19. Pre-COVID-19, 1 in 3 women reported experiencing sexual or physical violence from their partners in their lifetime, and 1 in 5 reported experiencing child sexual abuse at least once in their lifetime. So this suggests that home and family will size for threat and potential harm way before this phenomenon of economic crisis came about. So the UWI St. Augustine campus has observed the drastic rise in domestic violence. There were 203 police reports made for March compared with 42 reports for the same month in 2019, as reported by the Express on Thursday, the 23rd of April, 2020. This is a part of a worldwide rise in intimate partner violence and family violence, deeply rooted in gender norms and triggered by the COVID-19 state response and crisis. Women living with severe mental illnesses are significantly more to fall victims to violence as they are easy targets. We need to take into account, yes, domestic violence affects someone's mental health, but if someone goes into an abusive relationship, pre-existing with mental health issues, it makes them easier targets. They are easily manipulated. And if someone is already depressed, the perpetrator, if you notice about someone, you are a perpetrator and you abuse someone, you would take it to your advantage and keep them oppressed, keep them more depressed and make them feel as though there's no way out. You instill fear and feed their anxiety. So although women are victims to domestic violence, it is important to note that men are also victims of domestic violence. And in the Caribbean, it is safe to say that emotional abuse and violence in the home is more prevalent than physical or sexual abuse. And so we know that because men are taught as young boys that showing emotions are not masculine, they are more likely to stay silent about their abuse. There's also the reason of shame. It is shameful to say, well, your wife is physically or sexually abusing you, or she's taking all the money. That is financial violence and abuse. Or, a man might go to his friend and be like, my wife cussing me out and she's saying I'm no good and a this and a that. And the response would be, you taking that, big man like you? Like, it's shameful to not react to it in the way that it is culturally taught, which is usually associated with aggression or violence. And this lends to a high chance of them becoming violent and abusers themselves because they feel the need to show that masculinity that is taught and they are socialized in growing up. In the Caribbean, most men find their masculinity easily threatened and they feel the need to defend or protect it. And we need to ask ourselves, why is it that it is this way? Perhaps it could be to a low self-esteem. So they feel the need to prove themselves and they react this way. And if they are taught that, you are not supposed to show soft feelings, you're supposed to only show hard feelings, which like aggressive behaviors and violence, then that is the way they are going to react. Research suggests that the social construction of masculinity in the Caribbean encourages behavioral displays of violence and aggression as illustrations of manlyhood and neglects the feminine displays of emotion that they may feel make them weak and unmanly. So this can be a leading cause of repeated violence in the home, as they feel they need to show who's the boss, you know, and in these cases, it may also have a relation to mental health abuse that they may have experienced growing up in the hands of abusive relatives, because often, you know, you ask people, well, why do you treat your son that way? He's a young boy. And they'd be like, he has to grow up tough. How would he become a man? And so if this is the way we treat them and we're socializing them, this is the way that they would eventually turn to. This is how they would turn to in dealing with their emotional turmoils and their mental health issues. They're also more likely to turn to substances such as alcohol and drugs. And we know that any drug causes changes in behavior. And also this may result in aggressive behavior towards immediate family members, especially intimate partners. And this is also for abusive women. Perhaps growing up as a young girl, you are seeing and witnessing abuse in the home or in your community. And then abuse in the form of physical, financial, emotional, or even sexual can be formed as a defense mechanism because of the fear instilled as, okay, I don't want this to happen to me, and in order for this not to happen to me, I need to be this certain type of way. And they become abusers themselves in defense of that. Why persons stay in abusive relationships? This is a problem that we have in the Caribbean. You know, it's like, why should I leave him if he beaten she? But we need to dig deeper than that. There is gaslighting, threats, victim blaming. Sometimes, you know, the perpetrator also, they often victim blame. Well, you do this, so you make me angry, you make me vexed, like you look for it. Manipulation, saying, well, you have to stay for the kids. Financial dependence, often women are financially dependent on their partners. And so they feel like, you know, they don't have the necessary resources to escape their situation, not having somewhere to go or to run to. And I personally experienced bystanding something. A husband slapped down his wife and she was there flat on the ground crying, bawling her eyes out, and he was like, well, get up, we have to go home, get in the vehicle. Like, you have nowhere to go, you have to come with me. And that type of oppression it keeps persons in relationships because they feel they have nowhere out. They have no family, no friends, no support. And that's why it's necessary that as advocates, we create the opportunities for persons and we create support to help them and tell them, listen, you are in this situation, but you can get over it. We are here to help. You know, it is also taught from generation to generation. It is domestic violence and aggression. In Indo-Trinidadian households, I can speak from personal experience. My grandmother used to get beat by her husband. And, you know, it's the typical thing is where the woman stays at home, she takes care of the family and the household. The husband gets frustrated with anything, he goes out and drink, he comes home and he beats his wife. And they're like, oh, well, it's okay, you know, life is hard, you know, work is hard, like he's trying his best. But no one really looks at the impact this has on someone's mental health. Yes, you're physically harming someone, but do you really think about the trauma that you're instilling in this person? And this is passed on from generation to generation in families. And so it is because of this cultural reasoning, especially with the traditional thought, which disregards mental health and emotional abuse, we really need to take a step back and look at solving the problem and finding the root cause of it. Because of this male-dominated perspective, we also often disregard women. And we know also in mental health, we disregard the male perspective. And it's also important to know that domestic violence occurs in same-sex relationships, as Mia mentioned. And I will talk later on about finding ways to really treat and handle this situation. So moving forward, looking at the 4 pillars that we'll be looking at: fund, prevent, respond, and collect. As much as we need to help those who are victims of domestic violence, we need to also not forget about where it starts. We need to start working on preventing it from recurring in the future generations. Personally, I would like to see more of this from the government as well as advocates. So we find the root cause and find solutions in treating these accordingly. We need to start with the perpetrator. This can be in the form of programs and workshops that can be done via the school system, funded by the government and organizations, geared towards behavior and attitudinal change in children. We can start as early as the primary school level, where we can observe the treatment of young boys towards youth and vice versa. We need to talk about sensitivity training, because there's this popular story about a man who walked into a police station to report he was getting abused from his wife, and the police officers laughed at him and sent him back home. And so we need to respond in a way that is more sensitive to persons and their situations, especially for male victims and same-sex relationships. We need more lenient punishment and psychological support for women who are imprisoned for self-defense and protection. Before we say, yes, okay, she probably beat her husband, she probably killed her husband, but what it is that's going through someone's mind in that moment. She thinks, I have to protect my child, I have to protect myself. This person they will literally kill me. And in that situation, we need to think about these things and not just think about the consequences of it, but provide the psychological support that is necessary for women in that case. We need more implementation of laws and political commitments of laws that promote gender equality and laws that reinforce, I think we definitely need to work on our legislature with regards to punishment for reported cases of domestic violence. Perhaps if we raise or we make it more of a serious punishment, we can deter persons from actually being violent in their household, and we make it known that it's not just physical violence, there's sexual violence, financial and emotional. We need more investments in women's organizations as well as men, addressing the multiple forms of discrimination that is faced on a daily. We need to work on breaking the stigma around domestic violence in same-sex relationships, as well as creating a space for individuals in these relationships to speak up about experiences, as well as seeking help to get out of that relationship if they feel stuck, giving psychological help and support in overcoming their trauma. And this is also for men in abusive relationships. We need to start with breaking the stigma and making it more normalized to speak about experiences. And that in that way, we get to work towards helping those and supporting those who are victims. We need more male support in the fight against gender-based violence, because I believe that male involvement will encourage the elimination of gender stereotypes and the fight against patriarchal norms. We can have man-to-man talk. I think that is something, hearing it from someone who you can more relate to can have a greater impact on persons. Also, the involvement of younger individuals, I believe, is a crucial part of the movement towards ending gender-based violence, as we are better able to relate and help others understand from our generational perspective as a woke generation. We need more representatives of the LGBTQ plus community in the move towards the end of gender-based violence, because we need to put it out there and we need to break that stigma. And the only way we can do this is putting it out there, raise awareness. And so having representatives of that community can really help towards normalizing it and bringing more attention to that issue, because it is very much unspoken about in the Caribbean. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Samantha, for that very, very comprehensive presentation. And you brought up some really, really good points, especially in relation to men and mental health, and how, because of the patriarchy, we often don't really encourage men to be open about what they're going through and how that affects their mental health, and kind of like the cycle of violence. I think that was a really excellent point. So thank you so much, Samantha, for that. And in the interest of time, we're just going to move on to Taribo. So Taribo will be our final presenter of the day, and he will be talking about his work in the UWI Afrikaan Society as a best practice. So Taribo, whenever you're ready.
All right, hi, good day, everybody. As stated before, I am Taribo Branche, and I am the Secretary of the UWI Afrikaan Society, and I will be presenting on the role of men in the fight against GBV. So the UWI Afrikaan Society is a youth-led club that is dedicated towards African culture through education, activism, and the performing arts. With the help of the Institute of Gender and Development Studies, the UWI Afrikaan Society has taken an initiative to combat gender-based violence, or GBV. And this presentation will reflect on the ways men of the Afrikaan Society played an integral role in our club's initiative to combat sexual harassment. UNICEF describes GBV as a physical, sexual, mental, or economic harm inflicted on a person because of socially ascribed power imbalances. As previously stated, in all societies, women have less power than men, and as such, they are disproportionately affected by gender-based violence. According to the UN, sexual harassment is defined as any unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, verbal or physical conduct or gesture of a sexual nature, or any other sexually suggestive behavior, and is one of the components of GBV. Women are the most at risk to be taken advantage of on university campus, as they risk being sexually harassed by other students and professors. According to a 2019 survey on sexual misconduct, 39% of Harvard students reported to have experienced some form of sexual harassment. Among women, 32.2% of undergraduates and 21.9% of postgraduate students reported sexual harassment, which was 3 times as higher than the undergraduate and postgraduate men who've also experienced the same thing. Furthermore, the UWI has also appointed sexual harassment advisors, which definitely reflects the dire need for increased safety and protection against sexual harassment on campus. During the current academic period, the UWI Afrikaan Society decided to amend our club's constitution. Among the changes made, there was an inclusion of a sexual harassment policy, which outlines how the club should treat with reports and allegations of sexual harassment and misconduct. We were prompted to take this initiative because during the end of the last academic period, several allegations of sexual harassment were made against numerous of our male members. Therefore, to ensure the safety of our members and to guide the club's decisions in any case of any future instances, it was important for us to add a sexual harassment policy in the amended constitution. A few of the allegations were definitely substantiated, and as such, the executive board made the decision to temporarily ban the accused members until an independent investigation was conducted. For the safety of the victims and for purposes of confidentiality, the findings of the investigation will not be discussed. However, 2 aspects of the investigation that will be described are the inclusion of the sexual harassment policy in the amended constitution and the role the Afrikaan Society men played as allies to women who've experienced sexual harassment. The sexual harassment policy of the amended Afrikaan Society constitution outright expresses the club's stance that sexual misconduct of any kind will not be tolerated within our space. Furthermore, the policy allows for victims to make private complaints that will be privately investigated and communicated with both parties. Following the investigation, appropriate measures will be implemented, given the evidence and/or testimony provided by both parties. Any member found accused of sexual harassment will either be suspended or expelled, and if they are holders of office, they will be asked to vacate the position and the electoral procedure will be enacted. Additionally, counseling will be offered to both the victim and accused individual, and depending on the severity of the act and the wishes of the victim, the club may report the incident to the Trinidad and Tobago Police Force. In addition to the inclusion of the sexual harassment policy, part of the club's initiative to make a stance against sexual harassment was to reach out to both the victims and accused members. The men of our club played an integral role in this as they provided allyship to women who brought up the allegations. A few of the male members who took part in this initiative were close friends with the accused members, and as such, this process was extremely emotional for them. Many of them felt shocked, saddened, and were in such disbelief that esteemed members of the African Society were capable of such heinous acts. An interview was conducted with some of the male UWI Afrikaan Society members about the role men should play in combating sexual harassment. In general, they were of the opinion that being an ally to women meant that they needed to denounce the actions of their friends who they knew were responsible for the misconduct. Even if they were unsure of the credibility of the allegations, it is always important to be neutral and not engage in victim blaming. They tried their best to maintain a safe space for the victims by listening to their experiences and by avoiding bias and accusatory language. One of our male members indicated that women don't necessarily need the protection of men because the idea that women need protection and that they're weak is a result of patriarchy. However, it is more important as men that we check our learned behaviors in order to minimize instances of sexual violence. In conclusion, it is the goal of our club to be a safe haven for all our members. Hence, it is recommended that all other clubs on campus take an introspective look at their policies and the environment that they provide their members. As such, their policies should be updated and improved to meet certain goals and expectations, which include creating a safe space for all, irrespective of age, gender, or sexual orientation, providing a voice for marginalized groups, and establishing a zero-tolerance stance against predatory behavior of any kind. In essence, all men should play an active role against sexual harassment. It is important that we as men normalize allyship with women, listen to their experiences, and be brave enough to call out men for expressing toxic masculinity in order to bridge the gender gap and improve the safety and well-being of women on campus. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for being such attentive listeners, and thank you for my mentor, Marcus, for providing me with such great information and help. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Taribo, for sharing that experience with us. And I really appreciated that. And I think it brings a lot to this conversation. So thank you for that. And as you mentioned, Marcus, as your mentor, before we get to the Q&A, I actually have a question for everybody on the panel. And my question has to do with mentorship, because you are all young activists who are being mentored by people who have a little bit more experience in the field. So given that the Generation Equality campaign serves to foster solidarity among activists intergenerationally, I wanted to ask everyone, how has working with your mentors helped you to develop and advance your own activist or advocacy work? So Kelsey, Taribo, Samantha, Mia, whoever wants to go first.
Saj, do you want me to go first?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, great. So besides this this panel, I have been working with Renuka. She has been my mentor for over a little year, as long as the Calls of UWI initiative have going on. I can definitely say being a member of IGDS Ignite and the undergrad mentorship program, I have learned so much. And the new work of Calls of UWI, I've learned so much within the year under the guidance of Renuka. I would say it's very crucial, because despite as young persons, we may have our voices and we may think that we know how to go about certain things. The perspectives of an older person who have been doing this kind of activism work, it's important. I will say the way that Renuka and I will bounce off ideas and learn from each other is great. I will also say that it also shows you the gap between generations of knowledge. My knowledge to Renuka's knowledge in terms of like the tech. I might teach Renuka that, and in terms of phrasing stuff and looking at stuff from a theoretical framework or feminist work, Renuka will provide me with, and I will say that having a mentor in whatever field you're looking at is great. Yeah, thank you, Renuka.
Thanks, Kelsey, for that. And yes, Renuka is great. So Samantha, Taribo, Mia.
Yes, so I would like to thank Sadie for being my mentor, because even though we weren't able to have that many, one-on-one or personal or physical interactions, I truly did learn a lot from her. Without her, I would not have been able to put things and put my thoughts into perspective, and putting it in a more of a literature perspective with regards to research. Um, I got to learn from her experience, which I always appreciate, because I don't really have much of that so far in my academic experience. So I really appreciated learning from her experience, and the way she was able to use my thoughts and my ideas and combine that with her experience and her knowledge to be able to give you guys that piece that I gave. So yeah, I really appreciated it, and I wish I could have more of it, honestly.
Thanks, Samantha, and big ups to Lesedi. Right. So Taribo, Mia, any reflections?
Okay, I
Okay,
guess,
so
oh, sorry, you could go
you
next.
go. No, you go first. You go first.
All right, cool. So just wanted to give a big shout out to Marcus. He's been such a great help for me in terms of how his help would have built me in terms of my personal advocacy. What I could definitely see is how there's a lot of intergenerational, learning that was taking place. As he's a bit older. I'm gonna release his age, and I'm a bit younger. And especially in terms of the older generation bringing that foundation to the younger generation, especially because you could see it with him. A lot of the older feminists he would have gotten his foundation in terms of that, and he's in turn bringing that to the younger generation. So that's also very important. And on top of that, it's also have people from different backgrounds. So for me being an Afro-Trinidadian and him being an Indo-Trinidadian, we might have different perspectives on different things, but the fact that we were able to come to a common ground and we were both able to work on the same project together, it was very influential. And, it should reflect how us as Trinidadians on a whole deal with each other, especially dealing with, violence against people of Afro-Trinidadian descent and Indo-Trinidadian descent is very important to find that gap. So, shout out to you, Marcus.
Thanks, Taribo, and thanks, Marcus. Mia?
Okay, so hi. I know Sharice is not here, but I would like to thank them because I would also like to thank Marcus too, because Marcus did help me. So thank you, Marcus, as well. I would say it was like a very eye-opening experience in terms of like they really gave me a blueprint in terms of how to go about the life of being an advocate or doing work in the activism world. And it really showcased that it really is very, how can I say this? I'm not sound pessimistic, very long and drawn out at times. And sometimes there may be emotional instances where you have to take a step back and just allow yourself to feel what you're feeling, because like in the world of activism, sometimes it's very difficult and it's very emotionally draining. And I just like the fact that we were able to bond over our shared experience of being within the queer community, because a lot of the things we talked about that we wanted to change within Trinidad and Tobago, it was basically the same thing. And they really helped me like in terms of um, making sure I said what I wanted to say. And as Marcus said, solidarity, just having that shared experience was really something that I really looked forward to. And I hope that I could work with them again. And yeah, I would just have to thank Marcus as well, because Marcus is Marcus and he has a great mind, and we all know that. I mean, I want to thank Renuka because Renuka did help me, shout out to y'all, because you're not the best. But Renuka already know she's the best. So yeah, but thank you all so much. I just want to say thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives, and thank you all so much for acknowledging the fact that LGBTQ plus persons are a necessary part of this conversation. So yeah, that was nice.
Thank you, Mia. Thank you so much, and well done to Charisse and all of the other mentors. So now we have just about 12 minutes before we want to wrap things up. So I highly encourage everybody in the chat to leave any questions that you might have. It could be a question for the panel as a whole. It could be for a specific panelist. Just let us know and ask your question. I already have 2 questions here, and I presume this could be for the entire panel, but they were both asked during Samantha's presentations. So the first question is from Sydney Charles, and they ask, what advice would you give to someone who experiences GBV within their with family members or parents, seeing as they might not have a choice but to stay in that environment? What advice would you give to a person in that particular situation?
So especially with regards to GBV in the family, it's something that is more common and unspoken about. And so especially if it is your parents that you're dealing with, you need to handle it in a way where you don't offend anyone, but you handle it in a manner where you have your desired outcome, which is to talk about it and find a solution. So I would say, sorry about that.
That's fine.
I would say definitely find a peaceful, calm environment and try to bring across how you feel about it, the way that it is affecting you, and perhaps discuss why it is that they are reacting that way towards you, and come to a synchronized conclusion about why it is that this is happening and how you can work about it. I know it's not gonna work in one go. You know, they are gonna shut you down. They are going to not validate your feelings and your emotions, because we know that the older generations, they tend to do things like that. So, but keep pushing and keep trying, but you also need to look at the way that you handle it. Don't go about shouting at them. You know, do it in a more respectful manner and eventually ease it in. You know, if it is to the point where you cannot handle it, probably seek out some support somewhere. Talk to someone that you trust or seek professional help. Counseling is something that can be useful. Family counseling. I know a lot of people feel ashamed to bring counseling into the scenario, but it really helps to have a third perspective and having that mediation in the middle where you can have someone help understand and unravel your feelings and help to find a solution at the end.
Thanks, Samantha. Anybody else has any answers to that question before we move on to the next one?
I can add to that, Saj.
Sure.
Great response, Samantha. I would just add and say that in terms of someone experiencing that, it's never your fault. Don't blame yourself in any way or fashion. I will say, try to think about the situation. If you have a family member that is open to hearing your side and can intervene safely to your parents, I will say go that route. But if no one in the family is of a safe route, I will say if you can seek external factors such as counseling at school, and if the school can intervene, because in instances like that, the school has to intervene because it would affect a child academically as well. And it has the hotlines as well. They can call as well, the different resources as well. So I will say that. I will say not intervene by yourself, because your safety is very crucial in a circumstance like this.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. The following question is from Delisa, but I feel like the question is along the same lines, and perhaps we might have already answered it. It's how can someone reach out for help when their family members are constantly gaslighting them to believe that the toxic behavior is normal and that you're just overreacting. So I don't know if y'all want to maybe approach that from a different angle, because it's a little bit more about gaslighting. So does anybody on the panel have any advice for this person?
I would like to just to provide a different perspective. As
Sure.
my colleague Kelsey said, you know, you could reach out to some of your to help from school as well. But what I also need to add is a lot of time we minimize the importance of our friends, and a lot of times minimize our chosen family. So even though we have situations where your blood family is in a toxic environment, you know, you also have your chosen family who you could reach out to, who would be there for you to provide guidance and support. So don't minimize that, and, just reach out for them and, ask for that support and help. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Taribo. So before we end, we still have a little bit more time, but nobody else, as far as I've seen, has submitted any questions. So there were some questions that I had for Samantha and Taribo for your presentations that I kind of skipped in the interest of time. So maybe we could revisit those questions. The first question was for Samantha with regards to your excellent, as I said before, point about men's mental health with regards to emotional abuse. So what I want to ask you with regards to that whole cycle of violence and what you were talking about is, what do you believe is the best possible approach for this particular issue as it relates to mental health and being both victims of abuse and perpetrators of abuse? I know you talked about it a little bit with regards to like education from young.
Yes. So also, if we need to deal with, let's say, with the current generation or the past generations, we need to work towards breaking the stigma around surrounding mental health for men. Breaking the stigma, normalizing feeling emotions and expressing it in a manner that is not harmful to anyone else. That is not projecting aggression and violence towards others and those close to you is very important. Also, not projecting that or self-inflicting harm as well, because that can also be another issue. So we need to work surrounding that, breaking the stigma and providing the support. So like I mentioned, we need more involvement of other men in the movement towards the end of gender-based violence. So providing that support and having more males involved in supporting other men, men supporting men, probably, we can have testimonies, men could be like, listen, I was like this too. I felt the same way and I could relate to you, but I overcame it. And if I could, so can you. Here's the support, and you instill that hope and that support. I think support is very important when it comes to overcoming mental health issues, or even getting someone to admit that they have a problem, because that can also be a problem with the totally more traditional generations.
Thank you, Samantha, so much for that. And Taribo, the question that I was going to ask you is, what was one of the things that you might have noticed about the men in your group that might have made them uncomfortable in terms of addressing this particular issue? And where do you think that discomfort might come from?
Okay, well, thanks for the question, Saajid. The main thing that was really uncomfortable for a lot of the men in our group was like even starting up the conversation, and not just starting, but when the conversation was started, it was very uncomfortable to call out a lot of their friends, because a lot of the people who were accused of the sexual assault and sexual harassment were close friends who they knew for years upon years upon years, who they built such a strong connection with. So it was very uncomfortable for them. And, this mindset and this, discomfort generally comes from our patriarchal society that we live in, because as we all know, this patriarchal society is ruled by men, where men are the ones in control. So therefore, a lot of the sexual, misconduct and predatory behavior is normalized. So going against that and going against that kind of status quo, is very uncomfortable, and people get shamed for it and such. So therefore, conversations like this, where we, bridge the gap and, actual, where we grassroots, advocacy, similar to the Calls of UWI, where, you go out and engage with people, is stuff like that could change the culture and, could make this conversation, less uncomfortable. So, yeah, that's my 2 cents on that.
Thank you so much, Taribo. Okay, so with that, we come to the end of our webinar today. The first thing I just want to do is list out a couple organizations that you could contact if you have any issues with relation to GBV, or if you want to help any of these organizations, if you know anybody who's in a particular situation. You have CAPS, that's the counseling service at UWI. It's a free counseling service for all university students, all UWI students. There's the peer support group, Rape Crisis Society, the GBV unit, the Family Planning Association. There's the BTS project for child sexual abuse and Childline. And if you want to reach out to any of these organizations, they are on social media, they're on Facebook, they're on Instagram. You could also go to the Calls of UWI page, and we have the Calls of UWI page has those organizations and their contact information there as well. So that's at Calls of UWI on Instagram. So before we end, I would just like to issue a quick vote of thanks to all persons involved in organizing and running this event. So first of all, thank you so much to our panelists, Kelsey, Mia, Samantha, and Taribo, for your insightful contributions to this discussion. And please, please, please keep up the excellent work. Congratulations on a great discussion. We also express gratitude to their mentors, Renuka and Anjit, Sharice Berkeley, Lasady Legal, and Marcus Kisoon. I'd also like to thank the UWI Guild of Students for their technical support and giving us a platform. Thank you, of course, to the Institute for Gender and Development Studies for creating a space for youth engagement. And special thanks also go out to Catherine Chan, our Media Marketing and Branding Officer, as well as Khadija Peer for taking the lead on organizing the event. And finally, I'd just like to thank all of you who logged in and engaged in the chat and sent in your questions. Thank you for taking interest in youth activism, and thank you for showing interest in the fight against GBV. We wish everybody a safe and happy afternoon. Bye.